Daniel pushed the door open and froze. The room smelled like candles and cake, but it wasn't his birthday that was being celebrated. 'Twas Mark's, his younger brother's. Daniel's chest tightened as he looked around. His parents were smiling, their eyes bright with pride, laughter spilling too easily from their lips. The table was crowded with friends and relatives, all clapping and chatting as if this was perfectly normal. Daniel felt invisible. The chair across from him was empty for him in a way that seemed intentional. The cake in front of Mark gleamed, candles flickering, and Daniel could almost feel the weight of being ignored pressing down on him. "Surprise," his mother said, clapping her hands once. She looked at him, forcing a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We thought tonight would be a good time to celebrate Mark's promotion. You don't mind, do you?" Danielle wanted to tell her that. Yes, he did mind. He wanted to scream that tonight was supposed to be his night. But he stayed silent. He had learned to keep his voice small. He had learned to stay polite even when he burned inside. He nodded slightly and moved toward his seat, feeling like an intruder in his own life. Mark's smile was wide and practiced. "I didn't think we needed a big celebration," he said casually. But Daniel could see it. He saw how much Mark enjoyed the attention, how much he soaked in every compliment, every word of praise. And Daniel felt the anger rise. Not a quick flare, but a slow, cold burn that settled deep in his chest. This wasn't new. It had always been this way. Mark was the favorite. Mark was the one everyone looked at, admired, rewarded. And Daniel, he had learned to disappear. He took his seat silently. The room buzzed with congratulations, laughter, and stories about Mark's work. Each word, each laugh felt like a jab. Each glance from a parent was another reminder that he didn't matter the same way. He had tried to tell himself it was. Okay, that family wasn't always fair. That love came in different forms. But tonight that lie was impossible to believe. The betrayal was clear, undeniable. His own parents had chosen someone else over him on his birthday. Someone who didn't deserve it more. Someone who had always been given everything without struggle. And Daniel felt the cold certainty of hurt transform into something sharper. Not hatred exactly, but a desire for balance, a need to be seen. His? Father raised a glass. "To Mark," he said, and everyone echoed it. Daniel felt the weight of exclusion in that single toast. No mention of him, no acknowledgement of the day that belonged to him. He had thought birthdays were small islands of recognition, a moment where family paused to say, "You matter." But even that had been stolen. Mark laughed, modestly pretending he didn't want attention, but Daniel knew the truth. Mark had trained everyone to look at him, to celebrate him, to make Daniel disappear. And Daniel understood in a new way how much power that gave Mark, how easily he had become the center of the universe while Daniel learned to orbit silently. The cake was cut. The room sang happy birthday but for the wrong person. Daniel's stomach turned. He wanted to leave, but he stayed. Something inside him told him that this was a turning point. That this moment, the cutting of the cake, the clapping, the celebration at his expense was a signal he couldn't ignore. He had spent years being patient, quiet, helpful. He had been the one to fix mistakes, to lend support, to make life easier for Mark without complaint. And yet he had never been noticed, never been celebrated, never been thanked. The injustice of it was sharp, almost physical. Daniel's eyes scanned the room. His parents were smiling, proud. Mark was glowing, unaware of the storm building across. The table, every laugh felt like a knife. Every compliment felt like salt in a wound. Daniel realized that this wasn't just about a birthday cake. This was the culmination of years of being overlooked, years of being silent while Mark thrived on everything Daniel had quietly provided. It paid bills, covered failures, smoothed problems, all without recognition. And tonight, the pattern repeated itself. He had expected small acknowledgement, maybe a simple happy birthday, and instead he got nothing. The betrayal wasn't loud. It was quiet. It was the absence of love where it should have existed. Daniel felt a cold clarity. The unfairness of his life with his family had been a slow, grinding force. And now it had a name: betrayal. Not the dramatic kind with yelling and slamming doors, but the deeper kind. The kind that eats at you over years. The kind that tells you your efforts are invisible, your feelings irrelevant, and your existence secondary. Daniel thought of every missed opportunity for recognition, every achievement unnoticed, every time his parents' eyes had skipped over him to land on Mark. The anger simmered, but it was measured. This wasn't a tantrum, this was a calculation. So as understanding the rules of the family and realizing he had been playing a game he didn't know he was in. And he was ready to change the rules. He forced himself to smile as Mark made a speech thanking everyone for their support and acknowledging his parents' guidance. Daniel listened, nodding quietly, but inside he felt a plan forming. He didn't want to lash out. He didn't want a scene. He wanted recognition, but not in the way they would expect. He wanted to show them quietly, firmly, that their favoritism had consequences. That their neglect of him wasn't harmless. That being overlooked all these years had forged him into someone who could act deliberately and who would not be ignored again. Daniel remembered all the times he had stepped aside so Mark could shine. All the times he had fixed problems without being noticed. All the sacrifices he had made quietly, without complaint. Each memory added weight to the desire for balance. He imagined a moment when his parents would have to acknowledge the truth, when Mark would have to see what he had taken for granted. And a plan began to take shape not in anger, but in precision. This was no impulsive revenge. This was measured, deliberate. This was about setting things right in the only way Daniel knew they could be. The night ended, but the tension didn't leave him. He walked home alone, the city lights blurring past, thinking of the injustice and how easily it had been repeated. Each step was heavy, but each step also brought focus. He knew he had options. He could stay silent, accept the role he had been assigned for years, and pretend it didn't hurt. Or he could act carefully, decisively to make his family see him. To make them understand the cost of ignoring him. And the thought was both terrifying and liberating. For the first time in years, Daniel felt the possibility of control. The possibility of being recognized not for their approval, but for his own sense of justice. Daniel went to bed that night with a mind racing. Sleep came fitfully, filled with flashes of Mark's smile, his parents' pride, the clinking of glasses, and the unspoken message that Daniel had been forgotten. But beneath the hurt, beneath the anger, there was determination. He understood now that the betrayal wasn't just about a birthday. It was about a lifetime of imbalance. And he knew with a certainty that left no room for doubt that he would respond. He would not let this pass unnoticed. He would give them a gift, a reckoning that they would remember forever. Not out of malice, but out of necessity, a quiet lesson they had failed to teach him. And in that quiet, burning resolve, the story of Daniel's revenge began. Daniel couldn't stop thinking about that night. The images of his parents' smiles and Mark's triumphant grin kept replaying in his mind, sharp and unforgiving. Each time he remembered, the cold certainty he had felt at the table returned, stronger and more focused. He had been invisible for years, always overlooked, always the helper, the fixer, the one who made life easy for everyone else. And now, after this latest betrayal on his own birthday, something inside him shifted. It wasn't blind rage, it was clarity. He could no longer allow himself to be the invisible one. He had to act, but he had to act carefully. Impulse would ruin everything. The plan had to be precise. The lesson had to hit home without him losing control. He sat at his desk, staring at the blank screen of his laptop. Ideas came and went, fleeting and incomplete. Each one he discarded because it felt messy, emotional, impulsive. This was not about revenge for the sake of revenge. This was about recognition, about truth, about making his family see the consequences of the years they had ignored him. He thought about the quiet sacrifices he had made for them, the loans he had covered for Mark, the problems he had solved while no one thanked him, the mistakes he had corrected so smoothly that it was as if they had never happened. He realized he had a weapon hidden in plain sight: knowledge. Knowledge that his parents had entrusted to him, never suspecting he would use it not for destruction, but for revelation. Daniel started taking notes. He listed every instance where he had helped without acknowledgement. Every time Mark had been celebrated while Daniel's efforts were forgotten. Every decision he had influenced, every support he had given quietly. Every opportunity he had passed over so Mark could have the spotlight. The list grew long, almost too long to keep in his head. But writing it down, organizing it, turning it into a record made it real. It gave him power. He was no longer invisible. He had evidence, proof, and he understood that proof could speak, louder than anger ever could. He also thought about Mark. He didn't hate him. Mark wasn't a villain. He never had to be. He was simply oblivious, confident, and trained everyone to adore him. Daniel realized that Mark had lived his life on the foundation Daniel had built for him. Every success Mark claimed had, in some way, depended on Daniel's quiet support. And yet Mark had never noticed, never thanked, never even paused to see him. That realization burned in Daniel's mind, but instead of consuming him, it focused him. If Mark could be taught, even for a moment, the cost of his obliviousness, Daniel could make the lesson unforgettable. The moral side of him protested at first. He had been raised to believe in family loyalty, in patience, in letting things go. Daniel had imagined walking away, choosing silence, disappearing from their lives without confrontation. That path promised safety. It promised no guilt, no regret. But each time he imagined it, it felt hollow. It was like burying his voice, pretending he didn't exist, when the truth was screaming to be heard, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. The quiet, calculated form of revenge was not cruelty, it was justice. It was truth made visible. Daniel's plan began to take shape slowly, like a sculptor shaping clay. Step 1. Gather proof. Step 2. Organize it clearly. Step 3. Deliver it in a way that couldn't be ignored, denied, or dismissed. He didn't want yelling, confrontation, or chaos. He wanted clarity, exposure, undeniable truth. He imagined the moment they would see the records, feel the weight of years they had overlooked him, and realize that he had been the one holding everything together. It wouldn't be loud, it wouldn't be dramatic, it would be precise, quiet, an unforgettable dot. He spent days collecting documents, bank statements, receipts, old emails, and notes. Each piece of paper, each digital record was a small victory. It was evidence that he had existed in the background, that he had made sacrifices, that he had been the silent pillar everyone had taken for granted. Organizing it was tedious, but every detail made the eventual reveal sharper. He created spreadsheets, charts, timelines, all laid out clearly, impossible to dispute. Daniel felt satisfaction in the methodical work, the precision. For the first time in years, he felt in control. But even as he planned, doubts crept in. He worried about how his parents would react. Would they be angry, ashamed, regretful? Would Mark feel guilty or defensive? Could the plan backfire, turning the family against him entirely? He considered the consequences carefully. This wasn't just a prank or a momentary shock. This was life-changing. And yet the fear of inaction, the fear of disappearing again, of being invisible once more was stronger than any hesitation. He reminded himself that this was about truth. This was about finally being seen. Daniel also prepared himself emotionally. He knew he would feel tension, perhaps guilt, perhaps satisfaction, and all of it at once. He had to maintain composure when the time came. He practiced what he would say, how he would present the information calmly, clearly, without theatrics. He knew that anger or emotion could dilute the impact. The truth had to speak for itself. That was the power of his plan, quiet, undeniable, and direct. It would leave no room for denial. As the week went on, Daniel imagined the moment of confrontation. Over and over. He pictured their faces reading the documents, his mother's hands trembling, his father's forced calm, Mark's confusion turning into recognition. He imagined the tension, the pause, the sudden awareness that they had overlooked him all these years. And he felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Relief because he would finally be heard. Anxiety because he couldn't predict exactly how it would. Feel to see them understand fully, to see the truth hit like a wave. He realized he was preparing not just a plan for them, but for himself. In these days, Daniel also thought about the consequences beyond immediate satisfaction. Would this drive a wedge irreparably between them? Would it make family gatherings tense for years? Could he accept that? He understood that revenge-driven, measured, precise revenge had risks. But he also understood that doing nothing had already cost him more than any confrontation ever could. His sense of self had been diminished for years by silence, invisibility, and neglect. Speaking the truth, making them face reality, was the only way he could reclaim himself. By the end of the week, the plan was complete. Every record was organized, every note written, every step accounted for. Daniel felt a strange calm settle over him. The storm that had been building in his chest was now focused into a single purpose. He wasn't acting out of anger. He wasn't lashing out. He wasn't seeking destruction. He was seeking recognition. He was seeking balance. And for the first time in years, he felt like the center of his own life. Daniel looked at the final envelope, thick and weighty, filled with evidence, charts and a letter explaining his side calmly, clearly, without accusation. He felt the tension coil in his chest, ready to spring when the moment came. He knew that once he handed it over, there would be no turning back. They would see everything. Mark would see everything. His parents would see everything. And in that moment, Daniel would finally be recognized not just for the birthday they had stolen, but for every invisible sacrifice, every quiet effort, every unnoticed achievement that had been his alone. For Daniel, planning the revenge was as important as delivering it. The act itself was a culmination of thought, strategy, and patience. The tension of anticipation, the discipline of preparation, and the clarity of purpose had become a quiet power. He realized that this was more than a birthday issue. This was about identity, about self-worth, about finally stepping out of the shadows. And in that clarity, Daniel understood that the outcome didn't matter as much as the act of finally asserting himself. The truth, he thought, had weight. And it would speak louder than any scream, any yell, any moment of anger ever could. Daniel arrived at the cafe early, choosing a quiet table in the corner where he could see the entrance and maintain control over the moment. The envelope rested on the table in front of him, thick and heavy with evidence, charts, and his carefully written letter. He watched the door anxiously, heart steady but mind racing. Every step of what he was about to do had been planned, rehearsed in his mind countless times. The calm, collected Daniel they expected to see was exactly the mask he would wear until the moment the truth landed. When his parents arrived, they were smiling as usual, unaware of the storm waiting for them. They greeted him with warmth and familiarity, unaware that their son was no longer the quiet, compliant figure they thought he was. Mark followed, confident, as if he owned the space, laughing casually about his day. The contrast between Mark's ease and Daniel's quiet tension made. The younger brother seemed even more oblivious to the imbalance Daniel had endured for years. Daniel felt the cold clarity of purpose settle in his chest. This was it. This was the moment he had been preparing. Thank you for coming, Daniel said calmly, gesturing to the envelope. I have something to share. It's a gift. The word hung in the air. It sounded ordinary, but the weight behind it made his parents pause. Daniel slid the envelope forward slowly, deliberately. Curiosity flickered across their faces, but they did not yet sense the magnitude of what was inside. Mark, smiling lightly, leaned forward casually. "What's in there?" he asked. Daniel's eyes met his. No emotion. Focus. "I've organized some records," Daniel began, voice steady, controlled. "Financial support, assistance. Loans I've provided over the years. Situations I've handled quietly. Mistakes I've corrected without recognition. And a letter explaining how it feels to be overlooked, ignored, and unseen, especially when Mark is celebrated in my place." The words were calm, but loaded with the weight of years. He didn't need to yell, didn't need to argue. The impact came from truth itself. His father hesitated, glancing at his wife. "Records?" he asked slowly, frowning. His voice betrayed confusion, curiosity, and a hint of unease. Daniel nodded. "Yes, everything is organized, clear, and undeniable. I want you to see the truth of what has been happening. Not to blame you, but to show you the consequences of years of neglect." Daniel's tone was neutral, but the gravity of the statement settled heavily over the table. The envelope was opened first by his mother. She carefully lifted the papers, her hands trembling slightly. As she flipped through the organized documents, her eyes widened. Receipts, emails, spreadsheets, timelines, everything was there. Clear, undeniable. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The proof of years of invisible effort, of constant support that had gone unacknowledged, hit her with quiet intensity. His father looked on initially calm, but the color drained from his face as he began to read. Every line, every piece of evidence revealed truths he had never considered. How much Daniel had done without recognition. How often he had sacrificed for Mark. How completely their attention had been misplaced. His hands trembled slightly, and he swallowed hard. For once, the silence in the room was heavier than any. Argument could have been. Mark leaned back in his chair, confused at first, glancing between the documents and Daniel. He laughed nervously, but the smile quickly faded as he realized the extent of what he had taken for granted. Every accomplishment he had celebrated had, in part, relied on Daniel's invisible labor. The younger brother who had always been. The confident center of attention suddenly understood that his success had a foundation he hadn't seen. The confidence that had shielded him for years cracked in that moment, replaced by uncertainty. Daniel watched them closely. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The calm precision of his delivery, the undeniable weight of evidence, did the work for him. He could see it in their eyes, the shock, the recognition, the realization. This was far more effective than shouting, accusing, or creating drama. They couldn't ignore it. They couldn't dismiss it. They had been forced to confront the reality of their choices and overresights's. Finally, Daniel spoke again. "I'm not asking for apologies," he said. "I'm not taking anything from you. I'm just done giving. For years, I've supported, sacrificed, and stayed quiet. And now I've shown you the truth of what that has meant. This is my way of being seen." The words were calm but final, a line drawn that could not be crossed. Daniel stood slightly, gathering the weight of his presence. He was no longer the invisible son, the overlooked sibling. He was present, acknowledged, and in control of the narrative for the first time in his life. The room remained silent. The cafe buzzed faintly around them, but inside their corner, time seemed to pause. His mother's lips trembled as she touched the papers. His father's jaw tightened as he absorbed the details, and Mark's usual ease had vanished entirely. Daniel didn't wait for reactions. He knew they were processing, but he also knew that immediate responses were not necessary. The truth had been delivered, and that alone was enough. In the days that followed, tension lingered, but so did clarity. His parents reached out, hesitantly, asking questions they had never asked before, trying to understand the years of neglect they had never noticed. Their tone was uncertain, stripped of authority or judgment. Mark sent a short, awkward message, no bravado, no jokes, just acknowledgement of a reality he had never considered. The family dynamic had shifted subtly, but irrevocably. Daniel had created a moment that would resonate for years, a reminder that invisibility comes at a cost. And that acknowledgement cannot be taken for granted. Daniel himself felt a mixture of emotions. Relief, because he had finally been seen and heard. Anxiety, because he could not predict the long-term consequences. Satisfaction, but tempered with awareness that this revelation might forever alter relationships. He realized revenge was not. The point hit was truth, clarity, and balance. The act had been about reclaiming his voice, asserting boundaries, and exposing realities his family had ignored. And in that, he found something deeper than triumph. He found his own power, he reflected, on the experience often afterward. Revenge, he understood, didn't always bring satisfaction in the way stories promise. It wasn't about punishing others. It was about reclaiming oneself, asserting presence, and ensuring that truth could not be ignored. The gift he had given was heavy with consequence, but it was also precise, fair, and revealing. It was not cruelty. It was education, a confrontation with reality that forced reflection, understanding, and eventually change. Daniel knew he had drawn a line that could never be undone. His relationship with his family would never be exactly the same. But he also knew that he had finally stepped out of the shadows. He had shown them the cost of ignoring him, the value of his contributions, and the power of recognition. In doing so, he had reclaimed a piece of himself that had been denied for years. And for the first time, he felt truly seen. Sitting alone later that evening, Daniel thought about the lessons of the experience. Revenge, he realized, was rarely about satisfaction. It was about balance, acknowledgement, and truth. The act of revealing reality, of exposing what had been hidden, gave him clarity, purpose, and control. The family's shock and recognition were fleeting in their own way, but the deeper impact, the awareness that actions have consequences, would linger. In that quiet realization, Daniel understood the ultimate moral, being seen and heard. Claiming one's truth is more powerful than anger, more lasting than vengeance, and infinitely more liberating than silence.